walked into my father-in-law's funeral in black, not to mourn, but to expose the man who ruined me. My husband, Ethan Morgan, sat in the front row like a saint. As the pastor spoke, I rose. Every eye followed. "Before we bury William Morgan," I said, "we need to bury the lies choking this family." I handed Ethan an envelope. Inside, divorce papers, and an FBI case that will destroy him. Some women cry in silence. I chose to burn it all down. My marriage, his reputation, his life. But here's the twist. This wasn't just about cheating. This was about betrayal wrapped in millions, stolen from the family who trusted him. Stay with me, because this revenge, it gets darker and so much sweeter. Before everything shattered, I was the woman who had it all, or so I thought. To the outside world, I was Mrs. Claire Morgan, the golden daughter-in-law of the Morgan family empire. Ethan, my husband, wasn't just my partner. He was my safe harbor. He was the man who kissed my forehead every morning, brought me coffee just the way I liked it, and told me I was his greatest blessing. We lived in a mansion that overlooked the city skyline, with a walk-in closet larger than some apartments. But it wasn't the luxury that made me happy. It was the simple things. Movie nights curled up on the couch, Sunday morning pancakes, long drives with no destination. Our life felt picture perfect, like those fairy tales where the princess doesn't have to be rescued because she's already found her happily ever after. And there was William Morgan, my father-in-law, the man who built the Morgan legacy from nothing but grit and determination. He treated me like his own daughter, called me the heart of the family, and always reminded me that loyalty mattered more than money. His approval meant the world to me. When he smiled at me across family dinners, I felt like I belonged, like I was part of something bigger than myself. And Ethan? He seemed molded from the same stone as his father, driven, ambitious, respected. Whenever the world doubted me, he stood beside me, shielding me from every storm. I trusted him blindly, with my heart, with my secrets, and most dangerously, with my future. If someone had told me back then that the man I shared my life with would one day stab me in the back, I would have laughed in their face. Because back then, he wasn't my betrayer. He was my everything. If there was one thing I cherished more than my marriage, it was our family. Sunday dinners weren't just meals, they were rituals. Laughter filled the long oak dining table, wine glasses clinked, and stories from William's younger days were passed down like precious heirlooms. I loved those nights, feeling wrapped in the warmth of something unbreakable. Ethan always sat at the head of the table after his father, strong, composed, attentive, or so I convinced myself. Because looking back, the cracks didn't just appear, they were always there, faint but constant, like hairline fractures beneath polished glass. It started small. Phone calls he'd silence quickly, work trips that became more frequent, excuses that sounded rehearsed. There were moments when he'd sit across from me, his body present, but his mind elsewhere. Moments when his gaze didn't quite meet mine, when his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. I blamed stress, pressure, grief. William's health was declining. Perhaps Ethan carried burdens he couldn't share. That's what a good wife tells herself, right? That love endures. That hard times make couples stronger. Even when he'd rush out late at night, claiming business emergencies. I swallowed my doubts. Even when I found unfamiliar perfume on his shirts, I told myself it was probably from hugging clients or shaking hands at events. The tipping point? When my daughter Lily crawled into bed one night and whispered, "Daddy doesn't smile like he used to." That pierced deeper than any suspicion ever could. Because children, they sense things adults ignore. That was the first real crack in my fantasy. Small, but enough to make me start looking closer. And once you start looking, you can never unsee the truth. The funeral day wasn't just about saying goodbye to William Morgan. It was the day I buried my own illusions. I stood in front of the mirror that morning, not as a grieving daughter-in-law, but as a woman rising from betrayal. The black dress wasn't mourning attire. It was armor. The soft curls, the flawless makeup, not to honor a tradition, but to make sure Ethan remembered exactly what he lost. As I walked through the grand cathedral doors, whispers floated around me. Grief, sympathy. No one suspected the storm brewing beneath my calm exterior. Ethan sat in the front row, shoulders squared, face stoic, pretending to be the perfect son, the perfect husband. I almost laughed, because I knew behind those expensive suits and practiced smiles was a coward, a man who not only betrayed me, but disgraced his own bloodline. The pastor's words were a blur in the background. My heart thudded like a war drum. This wasn't a breakdown moment. It was battle. When the service neared its end, I stood up. The scrape of my chair echoed in the silence. Heads turned, confused. Ethan's jaw clenched, his fingers twitching. He knew. Somewhere deep down, he knew the reckoning had arrived. I walked down the aisle, each step louder than the last. And with the entire Morgan dynasty watching, I faced Ethan, looked him dead in the eye, and said, "Before we lay William Morgan to rest, we're laying the lies to rest too." I handed him the envelope, not just any envelope, but the blueprint of his downfall. Divorce papers, evidence of embezzlement, and sealed documentation already submitted to the authorities. He tried to whisper, to bargain, to save face, but it was too late. The funeral ended with one man buried and another man's life crumbling in front of everyone. After the funeral, life didn't explode. It decayed, slowly, painfully, like a house with beautiful walls but rotting foundations. The first few days were filled with forced silence. Ethan's absence wasn't spoken about, but it lingered like thick smoke in every room. His clothes remained in the closet, his cologne on the dresser, but his presence was gone. And it wasn't just me feeling it. Our daughter, Lily, only 8 years old, noticed the shift immediately. She didn't understand the word divorce. She didn't know the meaning of embezzlement or betrayal, but she understood absence. She understood coldness. "Where's Daddy?" she asked on the second night after the funeral, eyes wide, clutching her favorite teddy bear. I swallowed back every ugly truth and said, "He's staying somewhere else for a little while." Her little brow furrowed, confused but accepting. And that crushed me more than anything Ethan had done, because children adapt too quickly to heartbreak. The questions didn't stop there. "Is Daddy mad at you? Did I do something wrong? Why didn't Daddy hug me goodbye?" Every question stabbed me deeper, because I couldn't shield her from a father who had chosen greed over love, ego over family. In those moments I realized the damage wasn't just done to me, it was done to her, a wound she hadn't earned but was forced to carry. But as days passed, something unexpected happened. Lily stopped asking. She stopped leaving space for him at the dinner table. She no longer drew pictures with 3 figures, only 2. It broke my heart, but it also taught me resilience. We rebuilt, me and my daughter. At first it was just survival, pancakes in the morning, evening walks with awkward silences slowly turning into giggles, movie nights under one blanket, popcorn fights, moments of healing stitched together one day at a time. Then came the family, William's siblings, his cousins, even Ethan's own brothers. They reached out, not to comfort me, but to apologize. "Claire, we see it now. We should have asked more questions. We stood by him while you suffered in silence." It was bittersweet, vindication, but also the crushing weight of knowing no one had protected me before. Even Eleanor, Ethan's mother, The woman who once called me just the daughter-in-law sat across from me, her hands trembling, and whispered, "You did what none of us had the courage to do, save this family from itself." And I realized the betrayal had poisoned every branch of this family tree, but cutting off the rotten part gave the rest of us a chance to grow again. At board meetings, I wasn't the pretty wife anymore. I was Claire Morgan, guardian of the Morgan legacy. At family dinners, I wasn't the background character. I was the woman who stood her ground. And Lily, she didn't crumble. She didn't become bitter. She blossomed, because children, like their mothers, can survive storms if they see strength shining through the cracks. For a brief moment, I thought my revenge had already peaked. Serving Ethan those divorce papers at his father's funeral? That felt like the highest note. But fate, it had more cards to reveal. It started 2 weeks after the funeral, during a routine estate review meeting with the family's legal counsel. Arthur Morgan, Ethan's eldest cousin, was there, stern, sharp-eyed, always perfectly put together. His wife Vanessa sat beside him, quiet, polite, always playing the supportive spouse. At least, that's what I thought. The meeting was supposed to be straightforward. Closing William's estate, redistributing shares, making decisions about the company moving forward. But when the accountant pulled out the financial breakdown, something snagged my attention. A company name. One I didn't recognize. Morgan Logistics Subsidiary Holdings. Funny, I had lived inside this family for a decade, and I had never once heard of it. "Arthur," I asked casually, "why isn't this listed in the primary Morgan Enterprises portfolio?" Arthur's smile faltered, just slightly, barely noticeable, but enough. "Just a small side venture William funded before his passing," he said quickly, his voice too smooth, too rehearsed. But my gut twisted. The same instinct that warned me about Ethan was now screaming. I spent the next 2 nights digging. Old emails, shareholder records, archived files in William's office. And the deeper I dug, the uglier it got. That small side venture had funneled millions that had vanished from the main company's profit reports. Shell companies, offshore accounts, layered paper trails. But the signature approving every transfer? Arthur Morgan. I confronted Arthur the next morning, not in the boardroom, but on the front porch of the Morgan estate, where his mask couldn't hide behind titles. "Tell me about the Dubai transfers," I said simply, crossing my arms. His face paled faster than I'd ever seen. Vanessa, standing behind him, fumbled with her phone, trying to look innocent, failing miserably. It hit me like a freight train. This wasn't just Arthur's scheme. It was Arthur and Vanessa, a partnership built on deception. They had siphoned money under the radar while Ethan played the fool with his affair, using the family's internal chaos as a perfect cover. And William had started suspecting something before his death. Several flagged accounts, hidden notes I discovered buried in his files. He hadn't lived long enough to expose it, but I would. I didn't just have proof of Ethan's betrayal. I now held the smoking gun pointing straight at Arthur and Vanessa. And suddenly, my mission expanded. This wasn't just personal anymore. It was about purging every rotten branch from the Morgan tree, making sure my daughter, Lily, inherited a legacy free from filth. And if I had to take down everyone who stood in the way, so be it. Some women cry after betrayal. Some women drown in heartbreak. I made a call. Not to a lawyer. Those were already on speed dial. Not to the family accountant. He was compromised, afraid, too tangled in old loyalties. I called Brandon Steele, a private investigator with a reputation that made corporate criminals sweat. Former FBI cybercrimes, now an independent shark. The man didn't ask for explanations, he asked for access. Full financial records, all Morgan Company files, and personal accounts tied to Ethan, Arthur, and Vanessa, I told him directly. And I want anything off books, offshore accounts, hidden properties, fake partnerships, Everything. Brandon didn't blink. You'll have your answers, but you might not like them. I leaned in closer, my voice sharp as glass. I'm not paying you to comfort me, Brandon. I'm paying you to destroy them. The next few weeks were the quietest of my life on the surface, but beneath it, everything churned like a volcano ready to erupt. Brandon worked fast, files decrypted, financial trails traced, digital footprints resurrected from encrypted servers Ethan thought were deleted. Every morning, I got a new update, and every day, the scope of their betrayal grew uglier. It wasn't just Ethan sleeping with his assistant while funneling corporate funds for vacations and gifts. Arthur and Vanessa weren't just pocketing small dividends, they were orchestrating massive internal fraud, laundering through fake vendor contracts, draining retirement funds, even redirecting charitable donations. The kicker? They had used my name too, signed documents forging my authorization, making it look like I approved certain transfers. Their plan wasn't just to steal, it was to make me the fall guy if the system collapsed. But Brandon was ruthless. Hidden cameras revealed secret late-night meetings between Arthur and Vanessa. Deleted messages were recovered, showing Arthur bragging to offshore contacts about wrapping up loose ends after William's death, bank accounts in the Caymans, a penthouse in Singapore none of us knew existed. It was all there, in high definition. Brandon's final report landed on my desk, a 300-page dossier with timelines, screenshots, wire transfers, and damning footage. He looked me straight in the eye during our final call. You have enough here to bury them all, legally, financially, reputationally. And in that moment, I didn't feel pain. I felt power. This wasn't about heartbreak anymore. It was about justice. And I wasn't stopping. Not until every last dollar was accounted for, and every last traitor ruined. Brandon's report didn't just reveal betrayal, it laid out a full-blown criminal conspiracy, layer upon layer of theft, manipulation, and corporate sabotage. At first glance, it looked like isolated acts of greed, a missing $20,000 here, a questionable wire transfer there. But when mapped across months and years, the picture became horrifyingly clear. This wasn't disorganized stealing. It was a streamlined embezzlement operation, running like a machine inside the very company William Morgan had built from the ground up. The system started with Arthur, hidden behind a legitimate-sounding investment fund registered in Delaware, Brightwell Capital Holdings. On paper, Brightwell funded logistics expansion projects for Morgan Enterprises. In reality, those projects didn't exist. Invoices were generated monthly, approved by Ethan as Chief Strategy Officer, masked under special development budget, then quietly paid from high-liquidity company accounts. Once Brightwell received the funds, Vanessa handled the next phase, splitting the amounts across 5 smaller shell companies, each registered offshore under generic names like Norwest Shipping or Lakeridge Ventures. These shell companies then wired the money into luxury asset purchases, exclusive properties in Singapore, Dubai, private art auctions, even a luxury yacht docked in Monaco under a pseudonym. What made my blood run cold wasn't just the scale, it was the precision. Dates lined up with family emergencies or boardroom distractions. They siphoned the most money during William's cancer treatments and following his passing, while the family was blinded by grief. Brandon even uncovered WhatsApp conversations between Arthur and Vanessa. Claire's busy with Lily, and Ethan's too stupid to notice. It's the perfect time. They weren't just betraying me, they were actively mocking me while doing it. The worst blow came from Ethan's personal activity logs. Not only had he known about Arthur's operation, but he was receiving monthly kickbacks wired directly into an unlisted account in the British Virgin Islands. Money he used to fund his mistress's boutique business and lavish vacations. When Brandon presented me with surveillance footage, Ethan, Arthur, and Vanessa sitting in a rooftop bar, laughing about future expansions, my fury turned ice cold. This wasn't 3 people making bad choices. This was organized theft, premeditated, remorseless, and brutally calculated. With Brandon's help, we built a timeline, tracing every fraudulent transaction back 5 years, cross-referencing board meeting notes, internal approvals, and banking logs. Every file I would need to not only file for divorce, but to trigger criminal investigations. By the time I closed the dossier, I didn't feel like a scorned wife anymore. I felt like the executioner, ready to dismantle every piece of the empire they thought they controlled. And the first strike? It would come faster than any of them imagined. The day I went public was the day the Morgan empire fractured, loud, messy, and absolutely irreversible. I didn't go quietly to the police station. I went straight to the FBI's white-collar crime division with a hard drive in hand, accompanied by Brandon and my attorney. 4 hours, 3 agents, and 1 forensic accountant later. Their faces shifted from polite skepticism to laser-sharp focus. "This isn't petty corporate theft," Agent Michaels said, flipping through the compiled dossiers. "This is organized financial crime, wire fraud, money laundering, corporate embezzlement, possibly racketeering if collusion holds up." Within 48 hours, subpoenas were issued. Within 72, FBI agents raided Arthur's office and Vanessa's personal real estate business. By the end of the week, Ethan's accounts were frozen, his travel flagged, his passport revoked. But I wasn't done. I scheduled an exclusive interview with the most aggressive investigative journalist in the state, Samantha Lee from the Morning Chronicle. She didn't just report stories, she exposed rot. She dismantled reputations. She loved bringing down corporate royalty pretending to be untouchable. Samantha didn't waste time. "Go on record?" she asked. I nodded. Everything. My name, the documents, the betrayal, the real story behind the Morgans. By Monday, headlines exploded across every major outlet. Morgan family betrayal, daughter-in-law blows whistle on $50 fraud ring. Family fortune, family lies. Inside the scandal of the year. Claire Morgan versus the dynasty, betrayal, crime, and divorce bombshell. Stock prices plummeted within hours. Investors pulled out. Board members scrambled. But the most satisfying moment? Watching Ethan walk into court in handcuffs, Arthur being escorted by federal agents in front of flashing cameras, and Vanessa breaking down in the lobby, begging for a plea deal. I didn't shed a tear. I didn't blink. I stood tall, flanked by my lawyers, answering reporters. Yes, I knew. Yes, I fought back. And no, I'm not the victim. I'm the woman who cleaned house. That week, every Morgan connection Ethan, Arthur, and Vanessa had vanished. Former allies turned their backs. Family members who once whispered doubts about me now publicly supported me. It wasn't just revenge. It was full-scale annihilation. And I was only getting started. In the immediate aftermath, everything felt like standing in the rubble of a fallen empire. The family dinners? Gone. The company's golden reputation? Shattered. But what remained was clarity. And from there, we started to rebuild. The FBI's investigations concluded with swift indictments. Arthur and Vanessa took plea deals after their mountains of fraud were undeniable. Ethan, on the other hand, chose to fight. His trial became a public spectacle, every sordid detail of his double life exposed under the brightest legal spotlight. By the time the guilty verdict came down, the public had already made up its mind. Ethan Morgan wasn't a business strategist or family man. He was a fraud, a liar, and a disgrace. His sentence? 12 years in federal prison, without parole, full asset forfeiture. Arthur and Vanessa faced shorter sentences, but were barred from holding any corporate position ever again. The Morgans had a choice to make: collapse under scandal or restructure and rebuild. And to everyone's surprise, the board turned to me. "Claire, you're the only one who acted with integrity," the chairman said during the emergency session. "You knew the rot and had the courage to cut it out. We need that clarity to guide Morgan Enterprises forward." It was surreal, sitting at the head of the table where I was once dismissed as the wife who didn't understand the business. Now, I was CEO, and the first order of business? Full corporate transparency, restructuring all the subsidiary accounts, and launching an internal audit that ran deeper than any the company had ever seen. Outside the boardroom, life slowly found a new rhythm. Lily no longer asked about her father. She flourished, thriving in the safety of a home free from hidden agendas. We spent evenings baking, weekends hiking, and mornings planning little dreams that had nothing to do with money or status. Eleanor Morgan, once blind to her son's flaws, became my strongest supporter. She stood beside me during press conferences, helped me reconnect the fractured branches of the family tree, and worked quietly to ensure Lily never felt the absence of a father figure. Public trust didn't return overnight, but it returned. Customers appreciated honesty. Investors appreciated accountability. Morgan Enterprises stabilized, then slowly regained momentum. 1 year later, we hit profitability milestones Ethan never achieved, not by cutting corners, but by delivering value. Our story wasn't a headline anymore. It became a case study in business schools about ethics, resilience, and the power of decisive leadership. And me? I no longer saw myself as the woman betrayed. I was the woman who walked through fire, rebuilt from ashes, and came out stronger. Not just for myself, but for my daughter, and for the future of a family name I refused to let die in disgrace. Looking back, the betrayal didn't just destroy my marriage. It exposed every blind spot I had allowed to fester, both personally and professionally. The first lesson was brutal but necessary. Trust is not a strategy. In business, especially in family-owned companies, too much is done on the basis of "we're family" instead of verifiable accountability. William Morgan had built a great company, but he'd trusted Ethan and Arthur with too little oversight. That mistake almost destroyed everything. When I took over, my first directive wasn't about growing the company. It was about building structural integrity. I introduced real-time financial tracking, dual approval systems for large transactions, quarterly external audits, and anonymous employee reporting channels. Within 6 months, internal fraud attempts dropped to zero. Not because people suddenly became moral, but because opportunity was removed. On a personal level, the lesson was sharper. I had spent years making myself small in my marriage, telling myself that as long as my home looked picture perfect, I could ignore the cracks underneath. But the truth? Betrayal thrives in silence. When we avoid confrontation to keep peace, we create the perfect breeding ground for disrespect and deception. Leaving Ethan wasn't just about punishing him. It was about reclaiming my voice and my standards. For Lily, I wanted her to see a mother who didn't tolerate lies, who fought back with dignity and intelligence. Professionally, the experience made me sharper. I no longer sat in rooms quietly, afraid of making waves. I asked hard questions, challenged long-standing practices, and forced uncomfortable but necessary changes. And the results spoke for themselves. Morgan Enterprises was not only financially healthier, but culturally stronger than it had been in decades. One key takeaway stayed with me. It's easy to play victim after betrayal, but far more powerful to become the architect of your own recovery. Vengeance wasn't my goal, restoration was. And I learned that the best revenge is a life and a legacy rebuilt on strength, honesty, and unwavering principles. In the end, I didn't just survive betrayal. I rewrote the story entirely, for myself, for my daughter, and for a future that would never again be defined by someone else's dishonesty. The final sentencing felt almost surreal. Months of court hearings, testimonies, forensic breakdowns, all came down to a single gavel strike. Ethan stood expressionless, though the lines of stress had aged him a decade. 12 years, no parole, financial restitution in full. His name permanently etched into public records, not as a businessman, but as a cautionary tale. Arthur and Vanessa, stripped of their wealth, barred from corporate leadership, reduced to footnotes in business scandals. the mighty Morgans, brought to their knees. As I walked out of that courtroom, the world outside felt different, not because I had won a battle, but because I had finally closed a chapter that nearly erased me. For Lily, life returned to peace. No more hushed conversations behind closed doors, no more pretending. She knew the truth, and she saw her mother stand tall through the storm. We built new traditions, simple, joyful, free of guilt. Every bedtime story, every school project, was a reminder that we had survived, and better yet, we had overcome. At Morgan Enterprises, the culture transformed. No more nepotism disguised as leadership. No more closed-door decisions. People who once worked in fear now thrived in openness. We partnered with organizations that championed transparency, mentored young entrepreneurs, and rebuilt the brand, not as an untouchable dynasty, but as a company that learned from its mistakes. And me? I didn't let the past define me. I wrote my own story. I became a woman who didn't just endure betrayal. I confronted it, dismantled it, and turned it into a foundation for something greater. I realized life will always have moments where people betray you, systems fail you, and storms try to drown you. But we are more than what happens to us. We are what we choose to become after. My name is Claire Morgan, not the wife who was betrayed, not the woman who was left behind, but the woman who stood up, fought back, and rewrote her life. And that is a story worth telling, a story worth remembering.